This is Frank Gust, a man who committed acts so vile he became known as the Rhine-Ruhr Ripper because his crimes resembled those of Jack the Ripper, but with a darkness uniquely his own. For Gust, the murder itself wasn't the climax, it was only the beginning. What he truly craved came after death. Gust derived his pleasure not from the kill, but from what remained. His victims' bodies became the objects of his sinister obsessions. He would desecrate them in the most depraved ways. He became intimate with them, and he mutilated them so badly that those who discovered the bodies were inflicted with lasting psychological trauma. And disturbingly, that torment was also part of his pleasure. He once confessed that he would always be a threat to society and that he should never be released. And yet, unbelievably, his release is scheduled for 2026. Terrifying. This case is truly sickening, and I'm surprised it's not more well known. To take more pleasure from the thought of people finding your victims rather than the killing itself is a new one to me. I have to warn you that I will cover parts of animal abuse, as I feel it's important to understand his development as a killer. But I will keep it to a minimum. There are also not many images for this case, so you will see a bit more of me in this one. But before we dive in, if you find this video fascinating, then please drop it a like and leave me a comment below. And if you are new here, then please hit the subscribe button and consider following me on Instagram. It all really helps. Thank you. This video is created solely for educational and documentary purposes. It does not endorse or condone the criminal actions described within. Frank Gust was born on May 24, 1969, in Oberhausen, Germany, and from the very beginning, there was a sense of abandonment. His father, an alcoholic, didn't visit the hospital for 3 days after Frank's birth, choosing instead to spend what little money the family had drinking in local bars. Just 3 months later, Frank's mother, Dagmar, filed for divorce. Alone, she was left to care for Frank and his older brother. Frank never saw his father again. For a while, Dagmar's mother stepped in to help with the children, while Dagmar worked to support the family, but that didn't last long. When her mother fell ill, Frank was placed in a nursery full-time. Though he was fed and clothed, there was no love, no warmth, only cold, impersonal care. These early years were shaped by emotional neglect and a lack of affection that created a deep, invisible wound in his psyche. In 1973, things briefly looked hopeful. Dagmar had saved enough money to move her family, her sons and her mother, into a small but comfortable house. For the first time, they were like a family. Frank, a very scrawny and sensitive boy, began to experience what felt like a normal childhood. He especially treasured Sunday mornings when he'd crawl into bed beside his mother for cuddles. Life was good then, he would later say, but the good times didn't last. When Frank started school, he quickly stood out for all the wrong reasons. He was softer, both mentally and physically, than the other boys. Bullies targeted him relentlessly. In one incident, they pulled down his pants, smeared ice cream on his genitals, and let a dog lick it off. It was the kind of trauma that could shatter a youth's sense of safety, and for Frank, it did. Home life deteriorated too. When Frank was just 8, Dagmar began a new relationship. The man, whose name remains unknown, soon moved in and became Frank's stepfather. He was a harsh disciplinarian with no tolerance for softness. The gentle moments with his mother on those Sunday mornings ended. His grandmother and older brother moved out, leaving Frank alone with his mother and his cold, controlling stepfather. The emotional toll grew. Frank began wetting the bed, a classic cry for help in a child. But instead of receiving comfort, he was met with ridicule and punishment. His stepfather mocked him, Discipline was quick and unforgiving. I am not sure what his mother was doing at this time, but seemingly she did nothing to stop this. In their home, expressing emotion was a sign of weakness. Tears and complaints, they simply weren't allowed. Then came the moment Frank himself would later identify as a turning point. He was 9 or 10 when he used his saved up pocket money to buy a guinea pig from a classmate's family. Excited, he brought it home, only to be told he couldn't keep it because his stepfather was allergic to its fur. Desperate, he took the animal to his grandmother's house and begged to keep it there, but she dismissed it as a filthy rodent and told him bluntly, "Get rid of it." For most kids, get rid of it might mean setting it free or returning it to where it came from, but not Frank. He took the animal outside, tied it down, and slammed a paving stone onto its tiny body. As its intestines burst out, he didn't recoil. He didn't cry. He was fascinated. He touched them, and to him, they were warm and soft, literally pulsating with life just moments before. The intensity of the experience thrilled him. He would later say, "I liked the feeling and the warmth when I reached inside the abdominal cavity." This wasn't horror for Frank, it was an awakening. From that moment on, he was hooked. Death and the acts that followed excited him. He had discovered a fascination that would fester and grow into something absolutely horrific. The urge returned, stronger, darker, and utterly consuming. Frank could no longer hold it back. This time, he began stealing rabbits from neighbors' yards, slipping into gardens during the night. At first, he killed them quickly, snapping their necks or crushing them with his bare hands, before tearing open their soft bellies to get what he craved, their intestines. But soon, even death wasn't necessary for his pleasure. He started gutting them alive. The pain he inflicted gave him a sense of satisfaction, and as he entered puberty, something more sinister took root. His intimate desires began to entwine with the violence. He pleasured himself as the animals suffered, connecting agony with arousal. It wasn't just a compulsion anymore, it was a ritual of control, domination, and perverse gratification. He began to collect the entrails in buckets, along with the blood, and sometimes he would put them into a bath and get into it, pleasuring himself whilst bathing in his horrific deeds. Sickening. But this didn't suffice for long. The thrill began to fade, and his fantasies grew darker. Rabbits were no longer enough. While I was working on the rabbits, he would later say, I had already killed dozens of horses in my imagination. The violence was evolving, becoming more elaborate, more dangerous, and Frank was ready to take the next step. Life at home had become unbearable. Isolated and emotionally starved, Frank often went to his grandmother's house just a few streets away, but she wasn't always there. Alone and wandering, Frank began visiting one of her neighbors, a quiet, older man who seemed kind at first, but the man was an abuser of youths. He saw Frank as an opportunity. Over the course of the next few weeks, he groomed the young Frank, building his trust. The abuse began slowly and quickly escalated. Before long, the man was no longer alone. He began inviting others. Multiple adults took turns in abusing Frank behind closed doors. Frank never spoke about the trauma. It was buried deep, and not a single family member suspected the horror he endured, or the gruesome acts he was already committing on animals in secret. By age 15, Frank had had enough. Feeling utterly neglected and unwanted, he walked into a youth shelter and asked to stay. He told the staff he couldn't bear to live at home any longer. When they contacted his mother, her response was cold. She said, "You shouldn't stop travelers." And with that, Frank was effectively cast out. The shelter offered freedom, too much of it. It was an open facility. Residents could come and go as they pleased, and Frank took full advantage. He would vanish for days at a time without question or consequence. One welfare officer noticed that Frank's hygiene was abysmal. He didn't shower, didn't brush his teeth, wore the same ragged clothes day after day. His hair was unkempt and his body smelt foul. Everything about him screamed abandonment. He was adrift, surviving in the shadows, unseen and increasingly unhinged. During this time, he would spend a lot of time at the cemetery as he found it peaceful. Sometimes he would even sleep there when it was not too cold. Then, at age 15, his urges for the macabre took another step forward. He broke into a morgue for the first time. He enjoyed the smell of corpses and would later say, "You can't find that scent in any perfume shop." Whilst in the morgues, he progressed so far that he would open abdomens and touch their organs whilst pleasuring himself. Now this is where he may have got the thrill of leaving things disturbing for others to find, because on one occasion, he mutilated one of the bodies and beheaded it. Then he placed the mutilated body on a bench inside the morgue, and then placed the head, which had also been mutilated, near the gate at the entrance. And when the undertaker came in during the morning, he was horrified by what he found. A 15-year-old Frank was taking pleasure from not only abusing the dead, but giving trauma to the living. The fantasy of killing a horse never left Frank. He craved a larger creature, something more substantial than rabbits or small animals. But he was afraid of being kicked by the horse, so in 1992, he obtained a hunting license, and he had his plan in mind. "I wanted to cut open the abdominal cavity of an animal that was still warm," he later said, "either freshly killed or better yet, alive and somehow immobilized, then submerge my naked body in it and stay there as long as possible." By now, Frank was carrying a pistol at all times, becoming increasingly detached from reality and consumed by his urges. One day, his fantasy became real. He shot a horse dead, slit open its stomach, and crawled inside the still warm cavity, burying himself in its entrails. It was, to him, calming, almost comforting. But as always with Frank Gust, the boundary of fantasy went further into the darkness. Now he began to wonder, what would it feel like to kill a person? In his spare time, Frank would roam the forest, shooting many rabbits with his pistol just to pass the time. But on the evening of September 8th, 1994, he was planning on doing just this, until it began to rain. So he decided to just drive around for a while until the weather cleared up. On an empty stretch of road, he spotted a lone hitchhiker. As he got closer, he realized she was a woman. He pulled over. Her name was Catherine Thompson, a 28-year-old South African woman hoping to return to Holland where she lived. She asked him if he could take her in that direction. Frank smiled and agreed. They began to chat. It was pleasant. They even joked with one another. The mood was light, but behind Frank's smile, darker thoughts festered. He thought to himself, no one had seen her get into his car. He had a gun. He had everything he needed. Was this his moment? He kept the conversation going, all the while driving deeper into a remote forested area. Then casually, he pulled over and told her that he needed to take a leak. When he returned, he said he had lost his car keys. Catherine stepped out to help him search. But when her back was turned, Frank raised the pistol and shot her in the back of the head. The act of killing, for him, was a necessary step, never the climax. It was what came after that he truly craved. He dragged her lifeless body into the forest, stripped her naked, and forced himself on the corpse repeatedly. Then he slit open her stomach and reached inside, touching her warm organs. He was consumed by the sensation. This was giving him serious pleasure that he had not felt before. Afterwards, he began to stab her breasts and genitals before severing her hands and her head to make it harder for her to be identified. He disposed of her hands deeper in the forest, but he kept the head. He left her mutilated body near the road. He wanted her to be found. The grotesque state would deliver a shock to whoever found her, and this gave him a satisfaction he so desperately craved. Frank drove off with Catherine's severed head in his vehicle. He used it to satisfy himself one final time, and then threw it off a bridge into a river below. Catherine's body was discovered the following day, and the scene was so horrific it made national headlines. Who could commit such a brutal, deranged act? The public was terrified. Somewhere out there, this perpetrator walked amongst them, and Frank Gust, he couldn't stay silent. Whether it was guilt, pride, or a twisted desire for recognition, he told his on-off girlfriend at the time, Elsie, that he was the one responsible for the murder. She didn't believe him. It sounded too outrageous, too vile. To convince her, he shown her Catherine's ID card, but still, she didn't believe him. So Frank drove her to the spot where he had buried Catherine's severed hands. But to Elsie, they didn't even look real. Amazingly, she still didn't believe him. She thought that it was a macabre prank. Later, when she told friends what Frank had confessed, they brushed it off too, saying it was just a sick joke. They thought the hands were from a doll. No one took it further. But Frank, he seemed to be begging to be caught. One evening, while having a drink with his mother, Dagmar, she decided to read his tarot cards, something she did often. The death card appeared, so she reshuffled the deck and dealt again, and the death card surfaced again. Frank took this as a sign. He looked at his mother and admitted it. He was responsible for the hitchhiker's death. He told her it had been an accident, that the woman found his gun in the glove box, panicked, and during a struggle, it had gone off. He said he had left her body in the woods and that he hadn't meant for it to happen, but Dagmar dismissed it. "You always tell such stories," she said, brushing him off. They carried on as if nothing had happened. Frank wasn't just dropping hints, he was screaming for someone to listen, but no one did. Later, Dagmar told her then boyfriend, who happened to be a police officer, what Frank had said. He also waved it off as just attention seeking. To them, Frank wasn't violent. He was quiet, meek, not someone capable of such gruesome crimes. But they were wrong, terribly wrong. Not long after the murder, Frank's personal life took an unexpected turn towards something resembling normalcy. He met a young woman named Ruth whilst she was working in a local shop. They struck up a conversation. She found him odd perhaps, but not off-putting. Despite his haggard appearance and withdrawn demeanour, there was something about him that intrigued her. Frank showed interest, seemed kind, and before long they were dating. Soon after, they were married and a baby girl followed. Frank found steady work as a roofer, and from the outside, he appeared to be settling down, living the life of a quiet, working-class family man. To neighbours, he was unremarkable, maybe even dull, but it was all a mask. Behind closed doors, the urges never left him. They simply shifted to waiting, simmering. He returned to killing animals, such as sheep and foxes, or anything he could find. These acts became his outlet, a coping mechanism aimed at keeping his true compulsions at bay. But even that wasn't enough. The fantasies crept back in, stronger, more graphic. He began to imagine holding a woman's heart in his hands while she was still alive. Even in the most intimate moments with Ruth in the bedroom, when he struggled to perform, his mind wandered, not to her, not to love, but back to Catherine, back to the corpse, to what he had done, and only then could he feel aroused. Sickening. Frank Gust was living two lives, one mundane and domestic, the other monstrous and growing ever darker beneath the surface. One evening, Frank went out for a drive, as he often did, aimless and restless, with no clear destination. But this night was different. This night, he went towards the red light district. That's where he met 30-year-old Svenja Deitmer, a street worker. She climbed into his car, unaware of the horror that awaited her. Frank drove them to a secluded dirt road on the outskirts of town. There, they began to get intimate. Frank said, and quote, "I picked up a girl without specifically selecting her. She got in and we drove off. The girl was completely high. She sat in the passenger seat, almost asleep. During intercourse, I grabbed the gun with my right hand. Then I coughed loudly, on purpose, to cover the sound of the gun cocking. Then I pointed the gun at the back of her head. The blast rang in his ears. Blood spattered across the car, across him, but Frank felt calm, almost blissful. Now came the part he had been fantasizing about for so long. He opened her body, slicing into her stomach and removing every internal organ. As he handled them, he simultaneously pleasured himself, consumed by the warmth, the blood, the thrill of domination. At the climax of his deranged ritual, he held her heart in both hands, lifting it above her body. In his mind, this was the realization of a dark fantasy, but it didn't end there. As with Catherine, he wanted to leave Svenja's remains in a way that would horrify whoever found her. The next day, she was found near the roadside. Her chest cavity had been gruesomely opened. Her arms and hands had been severed and arranged beside her body, and her heart had been placed between her legs, partially inside her genitalia, and her head was missing. Frank later claimed he threw it into the river, just like Catherine's head. You can only assume, also like the last time, he used the severed head to pleasure himself one last time. Sickening. Given the similarities between the two murders, investigators quickly linked the cases, but there were no witnesses, no solid leads. The killer was out there, somewhere, but no one knew who he was. And so the public waited in fear for him to strike again and hopefully make a mistake. By now, Frank Gust had descended even deeper into depravity. His new fascination was wanting to blow up a woman using explosives while she was still conscious. He took this seriously and began to put his plan into action. He worked out the best way to make an explosive that could be inserted inside his victim. Once he had a prototype, he bought a sheep. He drove it to a remote area, then loaded 2 small explosives into a condom and inserted them into the animal's rectum. As he prepared to detonate, he began speaking to the sheep, but in his mind, it wasn't an animal. In my imagination, he later admitted, I was talking to a woman, not a sheep. I actually saw this woman in front of me. Frank then took cover and detonated the device. The sheep was obliterated. This wasn't his only new fantasy. Frank later admitted that he didn't want to just kill. He now wanted to torture, to prolong the agony for as long as possible. He began making a list of tools for what he called his next project, organizing items on his computer, duct tape, cable ties, blades, handcuffs, gloves, box cutters, and even spoons that had been sharpened on one side, which would be used to gouge out the eyes of his victims while they were still alive. Then came June 20th, 1998. Frank returned to the red light district. There, he picked up a 26-year-old street worker called Sandra Ostowich. Once inside his car, he asked if she would allow him to tie her up. Reluctantly, she agreed, thinking it was just another client's fantasy. She had no idea what was coming. Frank restrained her arms and legs, attaching them to each corner of the car so that she was fully immobilized. When she complained that the straps were too tight, Frank ignored her and sealed her mouth with duct tape. He tightened the restraints further, causing her visible pain. And that was just the beginning. As he began intercourse with her, he whispered the most vile threats in her ears. He told her how he would gut her alive and hold her heart in front of her as it beat in his hands. He told her that he would tie her to the tow bar of his car and rip her body in half. The torment dragged on for hours. He bit her and burned her with a lighter, but it is not known fully what he did to her. But then, unexpectedly, Frank stopped. Maybe it was a sign of guilt, or maybe it was another twisted torment. But he untied Sandra and pressed the gun to his own head and told her to end it all now by pulling the trigger. But Sandra was terrified and overwhelmed. She refused. She just wanted to leave. Frank then told her she could go, or so she thought. She ran from the car, but then Frank raised his pistol and shot her in the back of the head. She died instantly. This time, the aftermath was different. He didn't dismember her the way he did with his previous victims. He severed only her hands. No gutted torso, no mutilation. Perhaps he had satisfied his fantasy already, or perhaps, for a brief moment, he felt some form of guilt. Sandra's remains were found the next day by the roadside. The authorities launched another investigation, now aware that the killer had struck 3 times, but still they had no leads. But the brutality, the precision, and the horror of the crime scenes left no doubt a serial killer was stalking the Rhine-Ruhr region, and the press gave him a name, the Rhine-Ruhr Ripper, due to the similarities of the Jack the Ripper case. On April 9th, 1998, Frank and his wife Ruth moved into her aunt Geraldine N's house, bringing their young daughter with them. The arrangement seemed ideal. Geraldine had recently gone through a divorce, and the closeness of the family offered a sense of support and stability. Geraldine welcomed them, and they got along well. Frank, however, claimed the basement as his own private area. No one was allowed down there. It was his place, completely off limits. And though no one knew it at the time, the secrecy around that basement likely hid something very sinister. Perhaps the place where he tortured animals and where he turned his fantasies into a reality. Over time, Frank and Galinda grew closer. They confided in one another. She spoke of her own emotional pain following her divorce, and Frank, perhaps believing it would bond them, shared his own dark past. He told her everything. He confessed to the murders, and shortly after that conversation, Galinda disappeared. A missing persons investigation was opened. Frank was questioned, of course, but he wasn't seen as a serious suspect. Authorities assumed Galinda had suffered a psychological break and simply walked away from her life. No one imagined what had really happened. Later, Frank would confess. He claimed Galinda had wanted to end everything and that he was merely honouring her wish. Once she was dead, he dismembered her body and scattered her remains across a forest, leaving the rest to nature and the wildlife. But that explanation never truly held up. What investigators and many close to the case believe is that when Frank revealed his crimes, Galinda told him that he had to go to the police, and when he refused, she threatened to turn him in herself. And that was it. Her fate was sealed. Perhaps it was Galinda's sudden disappearance, or maybe the story had never truly left her. But Frank's mother finally spoke again. This time, she was visited by her daughter-in-law, Daniela. Dagmar had repeated the same disturbing story she was told by Frank during that tarot reading. At the time, her own husband, a police officer, had dismissed it, but Daniela didn't. She listened and she acted. Daniela went straight to the police. reporting everything Frank had confessed. Authorities were under intense pressure by then. The Rhine-Ruhr Ripper had become a media storm. Women were being killed, and the killer was still at large. Any lead, even the faintest, was worth pursuing. Police arrived at Frank's home and requested a DNA sample. He refused. He said bluntly, "There is no need. I am the man you are looking for." It was as if, after all these years, Frank Gust had finally gotten what he wanted: to be stopped. Following his arrest, investigators searched his basement. What they found removed any doubt. Murder tools, explosives, detailed fantasies written on his computer. The horror he had kept away, locked in that basement, was now in full view. There was no question. This was the Rhine-Ruhr Ripper. Frank Gust began his trial in August 2000. He was 31 years old. He asked for the death penalty, a request that could not be granted as Germany had long abolished it. He was open in court, showed no remorse, and spoke freely with the media. He made one thing very clear: he should never be free again. On September 21st, 2000, Frank Gust was sentenced to life in prison. He was found guilty of 4 counts of murder, but instead of a conventional prison, he was sent to a psychiatric facility for treatment. But it didn't last long. Within months, he refused therapy, saying that no treatment could help someone like him. "If I was ever released," he said, "I will kill again. These thoughts, they never leave you. Ever." He was transferred to a regular prison, where he remains to this day. Ruth, his wife, eventually left him, but for a short time after his sentencing, she wrote to him, desperate for an answer, some kind of understanding. In one of the letters, Frank offered a chilling explanation. "You and I are walking through a shop. A pretty woman comes into my field of view, and I think, pretty, and that's it. Now, the same situation without you there. I see a woman, and as soon as I don't classify her as ugly, the word slaughter immediately flashes through my mind." His daughter was told only that her father had to go away for a long time because he was very sick. Today, Frank Gust is now remarried. He met his new wife through letters sent during his incarceration, and as of now, his sentence is due to end in 2026. He claims he's changed, that he's a better man, deserving of freedom. He's already been granted monitored outings, where he can walk the streets again, but escorted by an officer, testing the waters of reintegration. But is he really safe? Even his own mother has warned, releasing him would be highly irresponsible. Frank Gust once said himself, "These thoughts never leave you." The question remains, has he really changed? I find it incredible that a man with Frank's criminal history is even being considered for release. His crimes were truly horrific. I will keep an eye on this situation and update you when something happens. Thank you for watching. Until next time, stay sane.